Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you're well and you've been reading something really amazing this month. This is my February roundup. Earlier in the month, I posted a video where I talked about the first 8 books that I'd read in February, and this is another 8 books to add to that, and some real corkers as well. So in total, I'm pleased to say I've managed to read 16 books in February 2023. And if I add that to my January reads, that makes 28 out of the 100 so far for 2023. So I'm making really good progress. And if I can keep up my motivation, I'm hopeful that I'm going to reach my 100 books in the year and maybe even more. You never know. So I've got some really good books to share with you that I've managed to read over the last couple of weeks. And there's some running themes as well in some of them. We have unreliable and unlikable narrators for one, and some really interesting and experimental prose as well. So I'm looking forward to sharing this with you, and hopefully you'll find a new favourite, or let me know if you've read any of these books and you've enjoyed them too. It's a book that I picked up last month. I was really excited about reading it. It sounded like something that would really engage and interest me. So it's a story of 3 women over the centuries who are related. First of all, we have Alpha, who is a young lady who's waiting to be tried for being a witch in the 17th century. And her narrative begins in a jail cell. Secondly, we have Violet in 1942. And finally, we have Kate in 2019. What was quite interesting about this is Kate and Violet are told in third person point of view, and Alpha is first person. And because of that, I kind of engaged with her more at the beginning. But the story is about these 3 women and their affinity with nature and these sort of powers that they have within them as they realise, their worth and their strength as women, but also in terms of their connections with nature and their ability to manipulate it. So Kate is on the run from an abusive relationship, and she goes to stay in a cottage that was left to her by her great aunt. And her great aunt is actually Violet, who is one of the other characters that is in the book. To begin with, I have to say, it didn't grab me. I thought it was going to. It reminded me, last month I read a book called Hex by Jenny Fagan, which I really, really loved. And I was kind of hoping for something a bit more, I don't know, a bit more dense. And to begin with, the chapters are quite short and they jump quite quickly. So you're going between these 3 characters and it's very difficult to kind of hold on to any of them. What I did find is the character of Alpha, who is the woman who's being tried for being a witch in the 17th century, I found her immediately the most engaging. And I think that's because her story is told through a first person narrative. So there's a sense of being closer to her, a sense of trust. And of it also, I think because her situation is so far removed from the other 2 women, it was quite compelling and interesting to read about what was happening to her and what had led up to this point that she was arrested for being a witch. Kate is on the run from an abusive relationship, and Violet is in a very unhappy sort of family setting. She loves her brother, but her dad's very distant, and she's not had a very happy childhood really, and there's lots of mysteries about her mother's life. So Kate runs off to live in the cottage that was left to her by her great aunt Violet, who she only met once. And her great aunt is actually the Violet that is the other character that we're introduced to. So I would have said actually a bit more of a slow burn than I was expecting. Despite the chapters being quite short, it took me a while to kind of get to grips with it. But what I would say is when I did, I really enjoyed it. And, when I was reading the last few chapters of the book where they're sort of rounding up what happened to these women, I have to say, there was goosebumps at one point when I was reading it. And I really loved the way that these 3 women spread out across centuries were kind of brought together through their sort of love and abilities to manipulate nature. So I would recommend it. It's not my favourite book of the month, but I'd probably give it a 3-star, 3.5, and I did enjoy it. It did grip me by the end, and I really found it an enjoyable read, and it didn't take too long to get through. Next, we have another book, Lessons in Chemistry. If you've been in a bookshop in the last couple of months, you will have seen this. It's everywhere. There are stacks of it all over the place. And I was really interested to know whether it lived up to its hype and the fact that it's been pushed so much in terms of marketing. But actually, I found it a really interesting and enjoyable book. And I was talking about unlikable and unreliable narrators at the beginning of this video, and she is one that, to begin with, I wasn't sure whether I was going to like her. Her name is Elizabeth Zott. She's a young woman who is a chemist. She's working in a lab, but she's suffering from a lot of sex discrimination. It's based in the 60s, and she's really not given the opportunities that she deserves. You know, she's an incredibly intelligent and gifted woman. And then she meets this gentleman there called Calvin Evans, and they fall in love and they start, a love affair. And he wants to marry her, but she won't marry him because she knows that her breakthroughs and her successes have to be on her terms. But then tragedy strikes and everything gets thrown to the winds. But this is a story about a woman surviving and getting past these, making a successful life despite of these challenges that she's faced, and the way she's been treated by the men generally throughout her life. And she ends up becoming a food presenter on a channel called Dinner at 6, but she continues, to be a chemist even in this setting where she's talking about food. She talks about the chemical breakdown of food and how foods can be combined to make nutritious meals, and she gets a real cult following in this role. But in heart of her hearts, she's always a chemist, and that's what she wants to do, and there's particular projects that she wants to work on. And it's the third person narration, but what's quite interesting is it sort of looks through the eyes of various characters, including the dog 630, which was just lovely. It doesn't always work, but it really works here. But it gave you an opportunity to see more of the action. And generally, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really funny. It was gut punchy, and really made me quite angry at places in a good way, in an intentional way, when we find out about how Elizabeth is, or Luscious as they call her in the labs, is treated by the men in her life. I find it shocking, and as I say, it made me quite angry at times, but also incredibly moving, and just a tale of survival. And this fabulous woman who in some ways is quite distant and unlikable, but is completely a product of her experiences, and we kind of fall in love with her through the novel as we go. So yeah, I would recommend this. I do think it's worth the hype. Again, not my favourite book of the month, but I'd give this a 4 stars definitely. And I think there's an important message to be had, as well as an enjoyable read in Lessons in Chemistry. So definitely pick this one up and read it if you see it and you fancy giving it a go. Next, as I mentioned previously in a previous video, I mentioned this book called What Writers Read, 35 writers on their favourite books. And I sort of challenged myself and anybody who was interested in coming along for the ride in reading some of the books that are in this little book described by other writers. So I've actually read 4 books from the 35 listed in this book. So if you're interested in finding out what books are included, it's What Writers Read, edited by Pandora Sykes, and it's a lovely little book and it's really insightful. As a writer myself, it's really important, I know, to read widely and read voraciously, and anybody out there who's a budding writer themselves, I'd give the same advice. Read as many different genres, even if you don't like a book. Think about why you don't like it, and it will help inform you as a writer as to where you want to go and what works for you. So it's important to read as much as possible. So I found this really fascinating, and there are some writers in here that I really love as well. So it was interesting to hear about what their favourite reads were. Just a few names: Sebastian Faulks, Deborah Levy, David Nichols, Anne Pratchett. There's just loads of really amazing writers in here talking about books that have influenced them. So it's really fun to pick this up and play along if you want to, just to remind you of that little challenge that I've set myself and everybody else as well. So the first one of the books that was listed in What Writers Read is Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, and this was shortlisted for the Man Booker in 2017, and it's a really short book. It's less than 100 pages long, but it actually punches above its weight for the size of it. And it also brings in a lot of themes as well, that were really interesting to see together. There's sort of an environmental crisis, there's a mystery, it's sort of a thriller as well, but it's all told through the eyes of somebody who's, you know, in a fever dream, is lying and languishing in bed after being poisoned. And it's a really quick read. It didn't take me long to read. It's a book about motherhood. It's a book about the connections between mothers and children. And it's also about what happens when those connections are challenged. But it's sort of kind of a stream of consciousness. There's an unreliability about the narrator because of the way she finds herself when she's telling this story. There's some confusion and time is going to and fro. So it can be slightly disorientating. And when I first started reading it, it took me a few pages to kind of find myself at ease with the style of the writing. And then I read the back again, reminded myself what it was about, and it all kind of slotted into place. But it was an interesting read, and you know, certainly, as I say, for the pages, you know, there's not much on them. Definitely worth picking up for a quick read, and one that really did pack a punch, an emotional punch. And raise lots of questions about what we're doing to the environment and the relationships, as I say, of the family. So one that I would recommend again. The second book that I read that's included in what writers read is Sorrow and Bliss. And this is one that was all over the place last year and I was really looking forward to reading. It was a Sunday Times bestseller and it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2022. So again, quite an unlikable narrator to begin with. When I first started reading this book, I didn't dislike it, didn't put me off. She's incredibly funny and that humour kept me reading throughout. But I did sort of question her behaviour and why she was acting in a certain way to the people around her. She has this most amazing family. And this story is about her relationship with her family, her struggles with mental health, and her love for her husband called Patrick. But what I would say is if you've read Bridget Jones and you enjoyed that, if you've read Fleabag and you enjoyed that, or also if you're a fan of Eleanor Oliphant is completely all right. Not an easy one to say, but a really good one to read. Those are the kinds of books that this reminded me of when I was reading it. And we're hearing the story about Martha and her relationship with her sister, which is fabulous. And I just haven't laughed so much at a book in such a long time. And by the end, there was a moment where I was like, no, it's you that's crying, it's not me. It's really touching at the end. I just love this book. And would recommend it to anybody really, but particularly readers who have enjoyed, as I say, Fleabag, Bridget Jones, those sorts of confessional kind of female-driven narratives. So again, this is first person point of view, so it really draws you in, but you can't help but fall in love with Martha and the experiences that she's had, and the survival that she comes through despite all of the challenges that she's faced. But yeah, I would say it is what it says on the table on the front. It's sorrow and bliss. There are times when I really laughed out loud and chortled at this book, and there were also times where it just made me so sad, and I really rooted for Martha. And she's a character who doesn't know herself. She doesn't know herself, and a lot of the book is about her search to understand who she is and these connections with other people. But yeah, I mean, 5 out of 5 for me. Just love this book. Really, really enjoyable. From a pure enjoyability standpoint, despite anything else, definitely pick this one up if you've been thinking about it. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are, whether you've read Sorrow and Bliss and whether you enjoyed it as much as I did. And onto another book that was listed in What Writers Read, and one that's been on my bookshelf for some time. This was published in 1987 and it won the Booker in that year. It's Penelope Lively's Moon Tiger, and this is a rather lovely 1980s cover that I have here as well. I bought this secondhand some time ago. I'd heard mixed things about it and just hadn't picked it up. And one of the things I'm desperate to do this year, as well as reading new books and sharing new experiences, is picking up some of those books that have been languishing on my shelves for too long and that need reading. And this actually did not disappoint me at all. It nearly was my favourite book of the month. It's about a character called Claudia who is in a nursing home. She's not at all well. She's nearing the end of her life and she's reflecting on her past and the adventures of her youth and the experiences and great loves that she had through her life. What's really interesting is Claudia is a historical writer, but she's got a lot of criticism about the way she's depicted history. And one of the great themes about this book is how reliable history is and how reliable memory is and who gets to tell the histories. And I found that fascinating, but she does with it in a really playful way as well. She plays with narrator and point of view. So when the book first begins, Claudia is talking to us in first person point of view. So we get a sense of, intimacy with her and reliability. But then there's also sections in third person point of view where we see events in a from a distance. We get to see more of what's going on in the minds, but not just her mind. So she may retell a memory of an experience or a conversation with her brother, but then we'll jump through to the point of view of a sister-in-law, Cynthia, and we'll see the same event but through her eyes. And so it's really interesting to think about how people remember events in different ways, what they take away from experiences, and the way she plays with it. To begin with, I thought this could be quite disorientating, but it wasn't at all. It was just joyful. But there isn't a clear linear plot throughout it. I mean, the book begins and it ends in the same location, but in between we hear about these great loves of her life and these events and experiences that made her who she is, who made her as tough as she is and made her as self-assured as she is. So she's another one that's broken the mould as Claudia, and a really enjoyable book. Not a massive read, didn't take me too long to read, but out of the books I've read this month, I think probably in terms of just literary ambition and payoff, this book will really stay with me, and one that I would really recommend to other readers as well, if you've heard or you think that might be of interest to you. So it starts off in modern day, but she talks about her experiences in Egypt during the war, where she's a war correspondent, and she's a spitfire. So yeah, definitely recommend this one, and sad that I left it so long to read it, but really glad that I have read it now. I finished it. The last book that I read that was mentioned in What Writers Read, I read on my Kindle, and this is a book that's probably quite well known to a lot of people anyway. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. So I've read a few Agatha Christie over the years. I think a lot of people have, and I've enjoyed them. I read less than I binged on Poirot on the TV and those reruns on a Sunday afternoon. I've always had a real fascination and enjoyment of those. But I picked up The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and quite looked forward to it. It's quite a short book, but actually I can understand why it's sort of listed as one of the better Agatha Christie books. It's a Poirot book, and it's all about the death of Roger Ackroyd and the woman also who would have been his fiancée. She dies and then Roger Ackroyd dies, but it's also kind of a locked room mystery as well. Everything happens behind a locked door, and Poirot is obviously on hand to give us the insights. But what I really loved about this book is the narrator, and it's difficult to talk a lot about it without giving away too much about the book. But the whole book is narrated by a doctor who lives in the village, and he becomes Poirot's sort of sidekick. The twist, I could see it coming just before it happened, but until then, I just it just really surprised me. and in a really, really good way. So if you've not read Agatha Christie before, or you've read a few but you've not read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I would recommend it, just for that twist at the end, which works really well, and I think has probably been influential for lots of crime writers since then. But it was a joy to read, and again, one of the books off the what writers read list. So that's 4 down, 31 to go. So I finished off the month with another classic, actually, another one that's been on my shelf for some time, and one that I've been wanting to read but hadn't got around to, and that is Muriel Spark, The Crime of Jean Brodie. So this is one, again, that I'd heard lots of people have said, oh, it's my favourite book, etc, etc. But I'd sort of read the first chapter or so in the past, but not got very far with it. But it was written and published in 1961, and again, it's about a character who isn't necessarily likeable, but it's very difficult not to respect Miss Brodie and sort of be in awe of her slightly. So the story takes place in a school in Edinburgh, and Jean Brodie is a teacher, and she takes a group of 6 young girls into her confidence, and they become her little group, the creme de la creme of the school. And their lessons aren't always about maths and English, let's put it that way. Jean Brodie believes in love and art and beauty above anything else, you know, above maths and above team sports and all sorts of things. She has a very unique point of view. So it's a very character driven book. There's a sort of a mystery side to it as well. Jean Brodie, they're continually trying to, you know, remove her from the school, basically, and the headmistress is regularly pumping these girls for information to try and find ways that they can get rid of Jean Brodie and her unusual teaching methods. So there's a bit of a mystery as to who it actually is that betrays her in the end. But we hear about her love life. I mean, there's lots in there to enjoy. It's very funny. Was it my favourite book this read? No, it wasn't my favourite book this month. You know, I didn't really love it, but I definitely think it was worth reading, and I can understand why a lot of people do love it. And Muriel Spark has got a huge back catalogue of other books as well to enjoy, if this is a book that's for you. But I'm glad I read it. You know, as I say, it's one that I hear mentioned a lot, so from that point of view, now I know what the fuss is about, and I did enjoy it. I definitely think it's worth reading, but in terms of you know, a thrilling read, you know, it wasn't up there with the other books that I've read this month. And another book that I've read that's been all over the place is Vladimir, which was one that I read on my Kindle when it came out at the end of 2022. It had this beautiful cover with this woman completely dressed in red with a red background and dark hair, and she's leant up against a wall, and it was the picture on the book that really drew me to it. But it's just come out in softback as well, so it's available to get for a little bit cheaper now, but I actually got it on the Kindle, and it's a really interesting story. Again, another unreliable, perhaps unlikable narrator, a female lecturer whose husband is a professor, and he's been accused of sexual misconduct over the decades. So she's dealing with this. They're living on campus, they're dealing with the accusations. He's been suspended while they're looking into the events, and there's a lot that you could talk about in terms of her attitude to these allegations and how she feels about these young women who've accused her husband. But alongside this, she's also fallen in love with another professor called Vladimir, who's quite a lot younger than her. She's in her late 50s. He's in his mid-40s. He moves to the area with his wife, who's also a talented writer. And we get this insight to this narrator who's very conscious of the fact that she's aging. She's feeling like a loss of power of being an older sort of mature woman. There was lots about it that I actually identified with working in higher education, but there was lots that I didn't as well. And there was one bit where I felt really quite let down by her behaviour, and I thought, well, this book's going in a direction that I didn't expect it to. But at the end, I quite found the resolution really satisfying, and it kind of felt like both her and her husband had to go through this sort of punishment, this purgatory, to have the ending that they have. And it's not a neat ending, but it is quite satisfying as a reader. But I really, really enjoyed it. I think, again, as I say, it's a book that would create a lot of discussion in a readers group. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. You know, as I say, there's lots to question about her views about women and the relationships between women and the power disparity between relationships between women and men. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I found it very engrossing, and I couldn't put it down, to be honest. It was another book, one that I would definitely recommend. 4.5 out of 5 probably, I would say. So one of my favourite books of the month, definitely. And last of all, I finished with a collection of poetry by Wendy Cope called Serious Concerns. And what's really lovely is I hadn't realised this is one that I picked up secondhand, as I do with a lot of my books, and discovered it was signed. How lovely is that? So a real little bonus there. It was signed by the great Wendy Cope. And what I really love about her poetry is it's incredibly accessible, but it also makes me laugh. I haven't laughed at poetry, I don't think, for so long. And she just writes these amazingly short and spare and accessible and funny little poems that I just really loved. And I was reading through these, and there's one where she responds to some criticism from The Spectator. And it says, Roger McGough and Brian Patton, have something in common with her, Wendy Cope, in that they write to amuse. And I don't think that I don't think that's fair, because some of these poems, she's got this talent for taking something every day and then punching you with it, you know, having this real emotional impact at the same time. So I think that's kind of unfair. But I also really love Roger McGough and Brian Patton for the same reasons. They write this really, you know, it feels quite simplistic on the surface level, which implies to me as a poet that it was actually probably really hard to write. But they have this ability to create a real emotional impact through their writing, but talking about the everyday. And isn't that what poetry is about? Getting us to see things in a different light, in a different way. So I really enjoyed this collection. You know, some poems more than others, but there were some that made me laugh out loud. And I did actually have to read to my husband afterwards. But they're an absolute joy. If you've not read Wendy Cope, I would recommend her. But particularly if you're not a fan of poetry, if you think, oh, poetry is not for me, she may very well prove you wrong. You know, she uses humour in a really disarming way, and incredibly enjoyable. So yeah, as I say, not only was it a signed edition, which really was the cherry on the top, but it was a lovely way to finish my reads for February. So yeah, that's another 8 down. And I've got my sort of TBR for March that's coming together, but I won't share it because I have a habit of going off piste. I often, you know, I think I'm going to read a particular collection of books and then go off in a completely different direction. So I look forward to sharing you the next stage of my journey for March. And I hope that there are some books there that you might enjoy. But let me know what you think of those, if there's any that you've read. And if you're new to the channel, please do like and subscribe and follow me for more recommendations and insights into my reading habits. But thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.